Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Elaine Chong, president of the Greater Philadelphia chapter of Ascend Leadership. In my day job, I'm a senior vice president with client portfolio management responsibilities within the Global Commercial Bank at Bank of America, where I've worked for the past 16 years. I hope you and your loved ones are doing well and keeping safe. With spring in the air, I look forward to brighter times ahead. Thank you for joining us today for this insightful discussion. I am a true believer in everything that you're about to hear today. It's truly a game changer in my mind when it comes to understanding the unspoken rules in corporate America and what it takes to be successful. I personally wish I had learned this early on in my career, but here we are. You get to benefit from the work that Gorick has put in over the past couple of years in writing this book. Shush, could you turn to slide 3, please? I want to introduce everybody to Ascend as an organization and what we do. If you haven't heard about us, Ascend Leadership is a network of some 50 chapters made up of professional and student chapters across North America, with about a 60,000 reach of Pan-Asian professionals working in corporations across North America. The reason I believe Ascend is a unique professional development organization is because of its life cycle approach and its tailored programming to mentoring and to networking with other similar professionals within your sector and across sectors. We partner with organizations like Stanford Business School. We have our own Ascend Foundation, where we publish insightful pieces of research that pertain to Asian American and our own unique challenges in navigating the professional environment, acquiring skill set that will make us as successful as we want to be. So, if you have time, please log into ascendleadership.org and, take a look at some of the great work that we do and the opportunities for you to get involved in. And above all, it is a terrific networking community. And we all know that we can put our head down and do our work, as you'll hear from Gorick, but it's also important to network. The next slide, please, Shush. We are an inclusive organization. And hence anybody who seeks to take advantage of our programming is welcome to join us in any of our activities. Our members are drawn from across industries, including financial services, consumer, healthcare, aerospace, technology, manufacturing, just to name a few. As an organization whose mission is to inspire, develop, and empower our members, our collective voices, yours and mine, really, really matters. If we as an organization is to stay relevant, we need to come together and work together to seek enhanced opportunities in pursuit of realizing the leadership potential of Pan-Asians in global corporations. So we welcome attendees from across the U.S. today. There are about 200 and last count, 26 folks who have signed up. So thank you. I'm always humbled to see the collective power when we come together. We rely on your support and our corporate partnerships and the generous speakers to bring quality programming and thought leadership. Our virtual events are made available at no cost. So please do consider signing up for membership to help us sustain this wonderful platform. Now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Gorick, who is the author of The Unspoken Rules, Secrets to Starting Your Career Off Right, a guide on how to become a top performing employee based on 500 plus interviews with professionals across geographies, industries, and job types. The book is scheduled for release later this month. So please, if you haven't pre-ordered, please submit your order today. Gorick's book has been endorsed by many distinguished corporate leaders, amongst whom are Arianna Huffington, Jeannie Rometty, Executive Chairman of IBM, Rich Lesser, CEO of BCG, and Ratan Tata, former Chairman of the Tata Group. Gorick is a career advisor at Harvard College, specializing in coaching first-generation low-income students. He has managed new employees at Boston Consulting Group, worked in investment banking at Credit Suisse, and is also a researcher with the Managing the Future of Work project at Harvard Business School. Gorick is a first-generation college student, is a graduate at Harvard College and Harvard Business School, and you can find him on Gorick.com. There will be a book giveaway to 10 lucky winners, courtesy of TD Bank. So please pay attention. Gorick, take it away.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Thank you so much, Shush. And thank you all for coming here today. I'm thrilled to be sharing my research with you all, and I'm excited to be spending the next hour or so with you all. I also asked Elaine and Shush about the audience today, and I've heard great things about how quick of a study you all are. So for those of you who are going about your daily lives, listening to podcasts at 2x speed, we'll go at maybe 1.25 or 1.5 today, because there's a lot of material to cover, hundreds of pages in this book, dozens of frameworks, checklists, talking points. Obviously, we won't go into all the details, but hopefully I'll give you a taste for what this book is about and the high-level takeaways. So my name is Gorick Ng. I'm author of a new book titled The Unspoken Rules, Secrets to Starting Your Career Off Right. You can preview the first 25 pages at my website, gorick.com. You can also pre-order on Amazon or any other places where you get your books. Before I dive in, I wanted to give a brief introduction about myself, LinkedIn profile and resume aside. I was born and raised in Toronto, Canada. That's me in elementary school. It took a while for me to dig that up. My dad, whom I didn't know very well, was a cook at a number of Chinese restaurants. And my single mother left school when she was 12 years old to support her brothers through school. She didn't end up returning to school until much later on in her life, when I was about 14 years old, after she was laid off from her sewing machine factory job. As the only person in the house who knew how to get onto the internet, who was proficient in English, I became the person to step up. I spent recesses learning to write resumes and cover letters, afternoons at the public library looking for jobs, and evenings coaching my mom. I mention this not because I was successful as that 14-year-old, but because I was unsuccessful. And it left me with an indelible impression, and one that's driven what I do with my career in life today, which is this question of how could I, someone who saw myself as diligent and resourceful, not be able to help her back on her feet? And how was it that despite me being able to get onto the internet, get to the public library, wasn't able to figure out how to navigate these spaces and systems? In high school, I was lucky enough to have met a now friend from another school who had applied to some of America's top colleges. I was in Toronto at the time. Canada has a number of really great schools. It didn't even occur to me that I could apply to schools in the US. I didn't know that top colleges like Dartmouth existed. I didn't know how to pronounce Dartmouth, if I were to be honest with myself. But this person ended up taking me under their wing and ended up showing me that there was so much more to the application process than what meets the eye. It's not just about writing your essays, it's about writing a certain style of essay. It's not just about asking for reference letters, it's about asking and holding your teachers through the process in a deliberate way. These tactics ended up working, where by the time graduation rolled around, I was lucky enough to have gotten into Harvard College as an undergraduate. Here's me and my mom on our first move-in day. One experience that really stood out to me in my college experience was one that I had leaving the library one night. I was spending the night studying for a test, and on my way home to my dorm room, I walked across and walked by a number of classmates of mine who were walking in the opposite direction. I was dressed in jeans and a hoodie. They were dressed in suits. It wasn't until the next day that I realized that they were actually going off to an invite-only recruiting event put on by an employer that had shown up that day. I had gone to that event, that I'd gone up to their table, I had picked up some of the free swag. Little did I know that there was a different way of approaching this table that some of these other students knew, but that I didn't know. They were saying the right things to the right people. They were networking behind the scenes. They had already built relationships at these firms before even showing up at this recruiting event. Unsurprisingly, these individuals ended up getting internships that I didn't even know existed. I ended up looking left, looking right, and seeking help from those who were a few steps ahead of me. and ended up getting waitlisted first, but then taken off the waitlist for an investment banking job at Credit Suisse. I then was once again on the waitlist for Boston Consulting Group, and then ended up maneuvering my way onto their starting class. When I was at Boston Consulting Group, I met a number of people who were able to once again take me under their wing and help me navigate the process of applying to business school. This is actually my second time applying to business school. The first time I was unsuccessful. The second time I was luckily successful. I say all of this not to humble brag, quite frankly, but really to share with you just how much trial and error I had gone through over the course of my early career in life. Where if I had to pick a meme on the internet that encapsulates how I felt at the time and how I quite honestly still feel today, it's this dog. I have no idea what I'm doing. I had no idea what I was doing. And I had a number of serendipitous and lucky encounters with people who ended up guiding me down the right path. This all led to me thinking this one thing, which is I don't know what I don't know, but others know. And so when I started stumbling once more when I was in the workplace and not knowing how to navigate these spaces, I ended up chatting with my coworkers and then friends of friends of friends, all the way through until I ended up speaking with over 500 professionals across industries, geographies, and job types on what they wish someone could have told them earlier about how to survive and thrive in the workplace. This has since become a 5-year-long research project, and that is culminating in a book to be released this month with Harvard Business Review. That's 3 years later, just in terms of pure writing, 2+ years, 2 additional years if I include the research, and here's the book today. I want to start off this presentation with a quote that didn't end up making it into the book, but that has really stayed with me and that has shaped the way that I look at the world, certainly as it relates to the Unspoken Rules, which is one by Sarah. This is actually a pseudonym. I'll read this out loud, which is, so many of my Asian friends see small talk as taking a break. When I bill my hours, there's no category for networking. Does that mean I have to do 8 full hours of work each day? I used to, until I noticed that no one gets ahead by keeping their head down. It's a powerful quote, and it's changed the way that I look at the world. Because if I think about work, I think of it as existing in a circle. And I think of work as completing your assigned tasks. In reality, though, there's a bigger circle that surrounds the smaller circle, and it's everything else. And I came to the realization that doing your job is only part of your job. The rest is performative, more than our seemingly meritocratic society is willing to admit. In other words, work itself is only part of the work. And it takes a certain mindset shift, especially as I went from school to work, to think about all the other things that I need to be doing as well. That we need to perhaps redefine our notion of work to include what may seem like extra work, but that's really essential work. Because the reality is, reality does not equal perceptions. How competent you are doesn't necessarily imply that people will perceive you as competent. And perceptions can matter just as much as reality because perceptions shape others' reality. And when it comes to this notion of extra work, I think of it as a tightrope that we're all walking all the time. And I call this tightrope the 3 C's, which stand for competence, commitment, and compatibility. The idea is this. Imagine a Venn diagram. When you meet your coworkers for the first time in a new job or a project, when you step into an interview, when you present yourself in a phone call or on a resume or cover letter, the people around you are sizing you up and they're asking themselves 3 questions. The first is what you see on the page already, which is, can you do your job well? That's competence. The second is, are you excited to be here? Which is commitment. And finally, do you get along with us? Which is compatibility. Competence, commitment, compatibility, the 3 C's. Our challenge, all of our challenges, is to get to the center of all 3 of these circles in this Venn diagram. Now, what does this mean? Competence means that you can do your job fully, accurately, and promptly without needing to be micromanaged and without overshooting the mark and making others look bad. Commitment means that you're fully present and eager to help the team achieve its goals, but not so eager that you put others on the defensive. Compatibility means that you make others comfortable and eager to be around you. But there's a catch. You have to do all of this without coming across as inauthentic or trying too hard, which isn't easy if you don't look like, sound like, or have the same backgrounds or interests as your coworkers who may be talking about pastimes and weekend activities and TV shows and music preferences that may not be familiar to you. Certainly, if that was the case for me. Growing up, I didn't have the money to be taking these vacations or to be having all these music lessons and such on nights and weekends. These were things that I simply couldn't relate to. And when these conversations came up, I was the one to always stay quiet. So again, it's all about getting to the center of all of these 3 C's all the time. Of course, there are going to be instances where certain C's will matter more than others. If you're, for example, in a highly technical role, it may be the case that your competence will matter more because your output is much more quantifiable and it's also more core to the position. However, if you are, for example, in a more teamwork-oriented job, it's much more difficult to be assessing how competent you really are because the duration of your projects is longer. Teamwork means that your output isn't necessarily measurable because it's contributed to the entire team. And then, of course, there are toxic workplaces as well, which I hope none of you are in, but that certainly many of us can relate to, which is compatibility of who is drinking buddies with whom, and are you buddy-buddy with the people who are high up the chain of command. So I have this theoretically here as 3 similarly sized circles, when in reality, some of these may be differently sized depending on your context. Now, you can also think about this as an exercise of trying to avoid some of these side regions, where if you're only showing competence but not compatibility and commitment, people are inclined to think, I know you can do the job, but can I see us working together long term? I'm not so sure. If you're just showing commitment but not the other 2, people will think, I know you want to be here, but what good is that if I don't want to work with you and don't want to be around you? And if you're only showing compatibility, people are thinking, I can see us being friends, but long-term coworkers, I'm not so sure. I'm not going to go into all the details, but you can imagine that you'd want to avoid these side regions as well, where there are also other perceptions that prevent you from getting to the center. Now, these unfortunately aren't binary states. There's a further complication to all of this, which is that they exist on a spectrum where you want to be in the middle zone. When it comes to competence, you want to be competent, but not so competent, at least in terms of perception, that you come across as overbearing. At the same time, you don't want to undershoot the mark and come across as clueless. You want to be committed, but not so committed that you're threatening to your coworkers. At the same time, you don't want to be undershooting to the point of looking apathetic. You want to be compatible, but you don't want to come across as a poser. And you also don't want to fall short and come across as passive and not engaging. So it's really not just a non-binary state, it's 3 spectra, 3 tight ropes that we're constantly walking all the time. So let me quickly pause here and have you all, for those of you who are interested in my book so far, please raise your hand. You can go to the participant button, look at your name, click on more, and raise your hand. And what will happen is Shush will take a screenshot. Shush will randomly select 10 individuals to receive a copy of the book generously provided by TD Bank, and we'll announce the names at the end of this presentation. And I'm seeing a good number of you signing up, so that's silent music to my ears. So continue raising your hands, keep it raised for the duration of this presentation, and Shush will randomly draw on those who are interested. Again, the book is about 200 pages. We're not going to go into all the details of all the frameworks, all the talking points, all the scenarios, but I do want to sprinkle in a couple of examples of how some of us could unintentionally end up undershooting or overshooting. And you can think about this in the context of your own life, as well as in the context of maybe your coworkers, if any of them are undershooting or overshooting. For the managers in the room today, consider how you're evaluating your coworkers or your subordinates. Who are the people that you consider your high performers? Who are the people you consider your low performers? And to what extent are they able to straddle this delicate balance of these three C's? Before I go into this, I should also mention, for those of you who are thinking to yourselves, wait a second, isn't this all about a presentation on how to become a top performer? It is, but as I hope I've convinced you all of, perceptions don't equal reality. And so top performer is really a matter of the eye of the beholder, and very much a function of how we navigate through so many of these soft skills. So let's go into cluelessness and what that potentially looks like. In my research, one of the most common questions I get asked is, how do I ask questions at work without coming across as lazy or incompetent? And it's difficult because if you're a newbie to a team or new to a project, your coworkers, your managers will by definition have had more experience in the subject matter than you. And so there is going to be this awkwardness around, well, this may not seem like a stupid question from my perspective, but it may be too rudimentary from the perspective of my coworkers. In which case, what's the unspoken rule here? Well, the unspoken rule is one that I call do and show your homework, where we've all perhaps heard the cliche of there's no such thing as a stupid question. Well, many of us subconsciously know that that's not necessarily true, where there is such thing as a stupid question. It's the question that you could have answered on your own. So what's the song and dance that we all go through? Well, step one is do your homework. Look through your shared folder, look on the internet, Google for the answer, look through your inbox, dig through prior email chains that you may have looked over, and try and figure out whether you can find the answer on your own. Then you do what I call bundle and escalate, where you're going to a coworker, but the one that's most junior at your level, and asking them one-on-one. At the same time, you're bundling your questions so that you're asking not 5 questions 5 separate times, but 5 questions in a single sitting. When you're approaching this coworker, ideally at the right time when they don't look busy and all that, you're showing your homework. So instead of just asking, Elaine, what's the login to this database? You're saying, Elaine, I'm trying to figure out how to log into this database. I looked at some of our internal documentation. I tried the password that we have listed in the onboarding manual, but I couldn't find it. Has the password been changed? It's a completely different way of asking the question, but what you're doing is convincing your manager that I can't find the answer despite having tried all of these options and exhausting my options. This by definition can't be a stupid question. And so you are finessing the question that you ask such that you avoid looking clueless and hopefully competent. Let's talk about being overbearing, where in the workplace, especially if you work in a team, if you work cross-functionally with people who have what are called swim lanes, their own scope of responsibility, you're going to potentially overstep that swim lane to the point of making someone look bad or threatening their authority. In which case, the unspoken rule here is to step up without overstepping. And that's to say that just because you're trying to avoid overstepping someone's boundaries doesn't mean you shouldn't step up. That was one of the rude awakenings that I had in my transition from school to work, which was in school, you're handed neatly packaged assignments with the instructions clearly laid out. All you have to do is fill in the blanks or fill in those bubbles in the multiple choice question and hand it in. Whereas in the workplace, getting ahead is all about stepping up, all about asking, how can I be helpful? Would it be helpful if I did this? Or volunteering for tasks that are noticed and reported. Also a concept that I talk about in my book. And here, one of the things that I wish someone had told me is the idea of keeping people consulted and informed, where managers will perhaps give you a task. And for the managers, think back to the last time you delegated an assignment and ask yourself, how specific were you around who needs to be kept informed and who needs to be consulted, where there's a list, there's an invisible list of people that you need to go to ask for their opinion on things. Otherwise, they could feel left out and see you as a threat. And you need to check in with your manager to make sure that you're on the right track. That way, you're spending 5 minutes making sure that you're on the right track with that 5-minute task before moving ahead and potentially wasting time on the 5-hour task or the 5-day task. So stepping up without overstepping means keeping your manager informed and consulting people who may feel like they have a stake to have in your work. It's also a great one for building compatibility, as I will soon talk about. When it comes to commitment, one of the most nerve-wracking areas that I hear about all the time and that I continue to struggle with is meetings. And here I uncovered this notion that I call learner mode versus leader mode. And the idea is this: when you are new to a team or a project, you are going to be in what's called learner mode. Learner mode is when people know or assume that you don't know very much yet. So you should be staying quiet, asking questions, taking notes, showing engagement. Otherwise, you're undershooting your zone of commitment. However, as time goes on, as you take on more responsibilities, as you own the Excel model, as the work stream becomes one that you own exclusively, you're going to eventually graduate, but in an unspoken way, to what I call leader mode, which is the mode where people start thinking to themselves, well, you're closer to the details than all of us, or you were in that client meeting, or none of us were paying attention. You were probably the one paying attention. You should know. You should know, and therefore ask thoughtful questions and be stating your point of view. The challenge that a lot of people bump into is one of assuming that they're in leader mode when they should be in learner mode. These are the coworkers I hope / I'm sure no one in this room, is sort of victim to this, but we all sort of know that coworker who is new to a team and says, well, when I was in my job, we did it this way. And that's an example of someone overshooting their zone of competence and commitment, where they're saying to themselves, or they're making others think rather, well, if your last job was so great, why are you here? In which case they're jumping to leader mode before having graduated from learner mode. And for fellow Asians, just even speaking for myself, I have the very opposite experience, where I am expected subconsciously by others to be in leader mode, but I still think I'm in learner mode, where I don't feel like I have all the answers. I feel like I'm too junior in this meeting, where I don't have the subject matter expertise. I should still be learning. Meanwhile, my coworkers are expecting me to speaking up, in which case I am falling short of my zone of commitment and looking like a learner when I should be a leader. So a few quick tips for those who may struggle speaking up in meetings, which I realize is a common feeling nowadays, especially as we're all working remotely, where one option, as many of you have already shown your ability to do, is type out your responses in the chat window. Actually, I've sometimes seen people be even more effective typing their answers out because people are actually paying attention to the chat versus potentially zoning out on people talking. Finding a meeting ally and comment amplifier, where if you have an ally in the meeting, perhaps they could direct attention back to you and remind people that the idea that this person is so confidently talking about was one that you had raised just 5 minutes ago and no one was paying attention. You could also volunteer for speaking roles of, if you, for example, were owning a project, are there opportunities to present this work to another team that might have a point of view or might find your work useful? One that I didn't do very much of is to follow up with people after the meeting. I often found myself thinking, oh boy, I wish I had said this, but I never said it. I guess I'll have to just throw it into my mental recycling bin. When in reality, you could follow up with someone and say, great presentation, followed by your comment, and building relationship that way, which could then go on to spark relationships, which we'll talk about shortly. And then finally, I'll also talk about this a little bit later on, which is to bring in outside information, where often, actually this was not only the case for me, but for a lot of my coworkers, there's a sense that when we're working on a project, that we're presenting on the project itself. Little did I appreciate that bringing in examples from other companies, other industries, bringing in examples from the news could open up a broader dialogue and position you as more competent because you're thinking strategically and also being on top of the latest developing news. Finally, when it comes to compatibility, this is a tricky balance, and one that I will mention, especially for those who, like me, struggle building compatibility with our coworkers, is to find excuses to spark conversation, where I think about relationships as existing in your first degree, your second degree, and your third degree as 3 concentric circles, where your first degree network are those who are in the same Zoom room as you. that all you need to do is maybe join the meeting a couple of minutes early, ask them about their weekend, ask them about their last presentation, ask them how their work is going, to turn who is otherwise an acquaintance, or rather a stranger, into an acquaintance. Once you do that repeatedly, you'll turn an acquaintance into an ally. And then once you get to know this person even more deeply, they could become potentially a mentor or a champion or a meeting ally to you in these meetings. When it comes to second degree networks, these are people that you don't yet know, but you could get introduced to. These are the people where I like to look at people who could see me as a reflection of themselves. If you're earlier in your career, potentially finding someone who could see you as a younger version of themselves. Where could you have gone to the same school, had the same extracurricular activities, had a similar background, whether it's personal upbringing or professional experience. And using that as a launch point for sparking a conversation of asking, Elaine, I noticed that you're connected to so-and-so. I'd love to pick their brain about A, B, and C. Are you by chance close enough to them to pass along a blurb on my behalf? And then writing a blurb for the other person to then send to this individual, getting on the phone or Zoom with them, and then again, turning someone who is otherwise a stranger into an acquaintance. When it comes to these sparks, it doesn't just spark at the beginning of your interaction of asking about how they're doing, asking about their work, finding commonalities between you and the other person. But this also relates to sparking conversations even after you first meet. A common question I often get is, how do I stay in touch with people? Well, one opportunity that you have in these one-on-one sessions is to hear about what matters to the other person. Where I try and get into the habit of when I'm reading the news and I come across a white paper, a podcast, a news article, even sometimes a social media post that might be relevant to someone, I will email them and I will say, FYI, I just came across this podcast. It reminds me of this and that. Just thought I'd share in case you haven't come across it yet. That's a good way to remind the other person that you have them in mind and that you really were listening and are engaged in what they have to say. So this is a mouthful, and these are just three of dozens and dozens of examples of how to navigate to the center of these 3 C's. But again, it's a tightrope. It's not easy. One thing that I will just prompt you all to reflect upon is take a moment and reflect on your 3 C's. To what extent are you overshooting or undershooting? Could it be the case that you're overshooting or undershooting with a certain coworker in a certain context? And also give yourself credit for the things you've learned. Where could you have been overshooting or undershooting in a prior job and you were able to self-monitor and then end up changing your approach to your work? And for those of you who are perhaps managers, think about the instances where your subordinates may be overshooting or undershooting, and ask yourself if these are unspoken expectations that maybe this individual, perhaps they're an intern, a co-op, an apprentice, just wasn't told before. And it takes a thoughtful, caring mentor to help them appreciate when they don't know something that they don't know. Good luck with the tightrope walking. I'd love to get some of your reactions. Feel free to reach out after the meeting. Would love to hear from you. One that I hear about a lot, and I want to share today in the context of the pandemic, in the context of the tough job market that we're all in, is the importance of seeing the big picture, which is one of these unspoken rules that falls under competence. And I referred to this a little bit earlier when I talked about how when I was going from school to work, I would put my head down, I would focus on my tasks, expecting that if I just did my tasks as I did in school, that would be enough. Simply checking the box was sufficient. Little did I know that those who were able to see the big picture were able to be that much more engaged in meetings, were able to have that much higher level of a conversation with higher ups in the organization. And as a result, were able to get ahead in their careers. One of my favorite activities growing up was Mad Libs. It's this activity book with a bunch of blanks and you can fill it in and create your own story. My book is full of these Mad Libs, and here's just one example where I think of seeing the big picture as including 5 questions. I actually have more than this, but for the sake of time and brevity, I have 5 questions that I would encourage you all to take with you and see if you can fill in for yourself. These are the 5 blanks, where the first one is my employer/client helps these clients do these things by these methods. The second is recently my employer/client has been pursuing these things to achieve these goals. These are the things that they're up to recently that you could, for example, check out through their newsletter, through their social media pages, by monitoring them in the news, which I'll talk about shortly. 3 is my employer client competes with these organizations because of these reasons. So not just keeping an eye on what's happening in your work stream, not just in your team, not just in your department, not just in your company, but other companies. What are they doing? And how can you bring that information into your day job? 4th is more of a self-reflection piece around this topic is important to my manager right now. It's their top priority right now. Where often, at least for me, I felt underappreciated sometimes because it didn't feel like I was working on work that mattered. And I was having a hard time getting in touch with my manager sometimes. Little did I know I was not their top priority person-wise, and the work that I was working on wasn't their top priority work-wise. And finally, if you find yourself getting stuck perhaps in your current role and not taking on more responsibilities, not getting promoted, whether promotion means more money, more responsibility, or the ability to move around, number 5 could potentially be a helpful question to ask yourself, which is, what problem can I fix? For those of you who are job hunting right now, I like to think of the first 3 as being relevant to you. Before you walk into an interview, consider trying to fill in these blanks for yourself. That way, you have an idea of what to say to the interviewer when they ask you, why are you interested in this position? Or where do you see yourself in 5 years? These are now blanks that you can pull off the shelf, almost like a library book. And finally, if you are feeling stuck, try and figure out whether or not the work that you're doing fits with what matters to those who matter. One activity that a habit that I have is using a tool called Google Alerts. You can go on to google.com/alerts or alerts.google.com, and you can type in whatever you want at the top. So in this case, I'll just pretend that I work at Samsung or that I'm a competitor to Samsung. And when I'm here, when I search for this, at least when I did this about a week ago, I saw that Samsung Display intends to lead the gaming industry market as demand for, I assume, work from home, gamers sitting at their desktops. Here's an example of what matters to someone high up, so much so that they're willing to put out a press release about it. Do this with the companies that are in your orbit, and you'll have a better sense of what's really going on out there. I set my alerts for at most once a day. I get a digest of all the different terms that I'm searching for or that I want to monitor. And then I enter my email, and then I get an email from Google after it scours the internet on a daily basis and then sends me all those news articles. That way I don't have to go out there and look for these news items myself. I would encourage you to consider this for 5 categories. 1 is your company. 2 is your CEO's name. 3 is your competitors. 4 is relevant industry terms. And 5 is topics you're curious about. We all know that your first job isn't necessarily going to be your last job. And during this recession and pandemic, I think we're all more aware than ever that job security is really not something we can take for granted. And so to the extent that there might be other areas that you're interested in, keeping an eye on this, even if you're not looking for a job actively, can help you understand what are the general trends that you can latch onto. And once you do decide to switch, you won't have to scramble to learn about this new space. You'll already have a sense just from reading these headlines. And I emphasize headline because I don't have time, let's be honest. I don't have time to read everything. But just simply skimming the headlines, the one line going down the page, takes 20 seconds and keeps me up to speed on what's going on. I mentioned this earlier, but I want to emphasize it in a slide, which is the better you understand what matters to those who matter, the better your odds of making an impact and the better your chances of getting promoted. This is from my last chapter, where understanding not only just what you're interested in, but your manager, your manager's manager, your manager's manager's manager, all the way up to the CEO, could help you align yourself more strategically and as a result, come across as more competent. There we have it. I'll leave a about 10, 15 minutes for Q&A. 3 quick calls to action to you all. If you are interested in my book, it's coming out this month, consider going onto my website, gorick.com. That's GORICK.com. Order my book. You can also go on my website. On the homepage, you can download the first 25 pages where I introduce the 3 C's and some of the other unspoken rules. I have 20 of them in total. And then the rest of the book, which you'll get on the 27th, unpacks how does this all look in meetings on your first day, in manager one-on-ones, when you have conflict in the workplace, when you're approaching a new project, when you feel stuck, when you want to get promoted, when you're renegotiating your salary, and when you're trying to leave gracefully without closing any doors or burning any bridges. I'm also offering bulk discounts through my publisher. So if you're interested in offering this for your team, if you're a manager, or contacting perhaps your HR department, or if you're an administrator at a school and are interested in giving this out as a graduation gift for your advisees or mentees, please email me. I'd love to chat with you for a group discount. And then finally, I'm on social media as well. So I will leave it at that, and I would love to take your questions. Thank you all for tuning in. I'll keep my slide up just for a few more minutes, and I will start taking questions.
We already have 2 questions in the Q&A box. I think the first one is what we kicked off with. So how does one work with a difficult boss who wants his own way?
Sounds good. I apologize. There's a bit of a siren outside, so apologies for the noise here. When it comes to that difficult manager who wants his own way, let me introduce this in with the framework, and then with some tips. And I'll just give you the caveat that it will be difficult for me to answer this because I don't know your particular circumstances. I want to really unpack what's really going on. But at a high level, when I think of a difficult boss, I think of a Venn diagram. My book is full of Venn diagrams, actually just maybe 2. This other Venn diagram is the Venn diagram of what you care about, what your manager cares about, and what the company cares about. And you can imagine not wanting to be at the side regions there either, where if you're only catering to your manager, you aren't doing the work that you care about, and you're probably not working on anything that the company cares about. I have an example here where, and actually this was a boss who wants his own way, where this was a venture capital firm. This manager had their own investing thesis. And this investment thesis wasn't one that this analyst really bought into. And more importantly, it wasn't one that the investment committee believed in. However, and I talk about this a lot in the context of feedback, the investment committee never really told this person up front that, hey, you're not really giving us what we want. Instead, they would give them subtle nudges, as I call in my book, where they'll say, what about this? Or have you considered this other option? This manager didn't end up really taking the hint and ended up continuing to propose the same ideas, and as a result, hold their own career back and the career back of the individual. So in the case that you're falling under, if you have a difficult boss who wants it their own way, I would ask myself, is what my manager wants in alignment with what the company wants? Because if it's not, I would be careful, because especially if you work in a company where you only get promoted if your manager gets promoted, and there are politics around superseding your manager and work it unless you move into a different department, I would be careful, and I would try and ask myself, do I want to play this game and follow my manager? And does following my manager actually help them help me? In which case, there's an element of maybe just playing the game. However, if you're from the opposite point of view and you think to yourself, actually doing what my manager wants might appease my manager, but is going to drive me insane and is not going to get a career anywhere, then I would consider thinking about whether it makes sense to move perhaps somewhere else. Happy to answer any follow-up questions. That's as general but specific as I sort of will hopefully try to be. Can you give any resume tips? I can. I'll just riff really quickly, where should be 1 page, even margins, same font, Don't use any of the colorful templates online. You're going to get hired not because the color blue is on your page, but because there's substance to it. When it comes to the substance, I think about this also as a Mad Libs exercise of nouns, verbs, and numbers, where every bullet point starts off with a past tense verb. You can look for action verbs online. Make sure that you have a different one for each bullet point. And then Google for the industry terms that are relevant to your space. So if you're working in finance, does it make sense to talk about your budget, your forecasting, your financial models? Does it make sense to talk about the EBITDA of your company? If you're working in supply chain, should you be talking about procurement? Should you be talking about specific tools that you use in your day job? Should you be dropping terms like Salesforce? And then finally, numbers is around showing growth and showing magnitude. So are you managing a portfolio of money? Are you working on a client that is a large one? You can quantify the impact based on the number of employees they have, their market capitalization, their revenue. And then finally, showing growth, where could you say that you increase revenues or decrease costs? If I think about the private sector, in the end, that is what companies care about. So the more you can quantify your impact as helped increase this or decrease that, that can hopefully help you out as well. And then converting those into percentages. Happy to go into more detail, but those are my quick tips on the resume front. And then when it comes to Kenneth Wong, can you tell us with the most difficult issue you faced and how you think through it? The most difficult, at least workplace issue I faced was when I was in consulting. I was pulling late nights. I was actually pulling regular all-nighters. And I was creating a PowerPoint presentation for a client. My manager was hands-off. And every time I went to my manager would say, I'm not feeling it. I mean, talk about useless feedback, right? So every time I went to my manager, they would give me this useless feedback. I would go back and change the presentation all around, give it back to them. They would say it's not good enough. And this repeated itself for about 4 to 6 weeks. And you're giving me a lot of credit there, Kenneth, about thinking through it. I just didn't know what I didn't know at the time. It took another manager to pull me aside and say, Gorick, stop listening to instructions so closely. And I was taken aback. I thought, I mean, isn't that what being a good employee is all about? And he gave me a number of points that have really made their way into the book, which is you're hired to do more than just follow instructions. You're hired to think. You're hired to solve a problem, to get a job done, to do this thing for a client. The first time your manager is paying attention to you is when you are starting a meeting with them. And the last time they're thinking about you is when you leave that meeting. For the managers in the room, I apologize. I know that may not be fair to all of you, but when I think about how much managers have going on a daily basis, that is true to some degree, where managing you is only a part of their portfolio. They've got other things going on as well. And so one of the things that I learned from this experience, I didn't learn it from this particular experience, but it took these hundreds of interviews to really learn, is when you're delegated a task, you should be asking yourself 4 questions. What, why, what, how, by when. This is also in the book, where when you're delegated a task, you should understand what's the broader objective. What problem are we trying to solve? Who is the audience for this presentation and what do they care about? If you don't, you might, like me, end up wasting your time on work that doesn't matter. And then finally, the what, how, by when is you need to understand what do you need to do, how do you need to do it, and by when do you need to do it. If not, you will do the wrong work, do it the wrong way, or not do it on time. And I was doing all 3 of these things. And finally, you have to go to your manager with something to react to. So there's a difference between going to your manager and saying, and when I say you, I mean me. I mean, this was me for those 6 months. Actually it was 3, well, it was initially 4 to 6 weeks, and then it turned into months, where I ended up going to my manager saying, what do I do next? Wrong. Turns out that's not the unspoken rule. The unspoken rule is you go to your manager with something to react to. So you go to your manager and say, I'm trying to do this. I've done this. What are your reactions? Or better yet, you say, I've done this or this. Which do you prefer? Or you can say, I'm going to do 1, 2, or 3. I'm going to do 1 if I don't hear from you. How does that sound? And so really holding your manager's hands and and the mindset shift that I had is my manager's job isn't to manage me. It's my job to manage my manager. That's the idea of managing up. So, I mean, that's saved my career, quite frankly. And I'm grateful to have had that sort of framework now marked up so heavily into my brain. So next question is, what are your suggestions in networking with managers and senior leaders at the company? What are some of the topics that would spark conversations and make an impression? Great question. Let me answer. I see 2 question marks. So I'm going to try and answer both. Where suggestions with networking with managers and senior leaders. 2 quick tips on that. One is digging through the internal company directory and finding someone who could potentially see you as a younger version of themselves, or an area where maybe you know something that they don't, or where you can bring something that's valuable to them. So could you have, for example, worked in a particular space like nonprofits, and you can see that they're really interested in nonprofits, or you worked on a particular type of project in the company, and that's something that they're probably thinking about. That's the first one. The second one is being careful around the politics, the commitment of not overshooting and being threatening, where being careful that if you're networking, for example, with your manager's manager, that your manager is in tune with that and knows that you're having a casual conversation and not trying to go above their head. Otherwise, you'll overshoot your zone of commitment and end up looking potentially threatening. When it comes to the topics that could spark conversation, the first thing I do is I stalk them profusely online. I look at their entire LinkedIn profile. I try and understand what are the choices they made and pivot points that they made, and turn questions into that. Often questions that will incite a good conversation is questions like, how did you think about this? Or what prompted you to do that? Or if you had a chance to go back and have this particular experience again, what would you do differently? So really asking these open-ended questions that allow them to talk about themselves. Other questions that I would encourage you to potentially go in with and to do some homework on is, what are they working on? So one question you could ask is, what's been keeping you busy over the last couple of months? What are you looking forward to as you look out into the next quarter or next year? Starting with higher up that you're familiar with, maybe even just asking them, like, for example, how do you feel like that prior meeting went? Starting off with something where you have that compatibility already, and then branching out into these open-ended questions from there. One thing that I will mention is, when it comes to conversations like this, it can often be nerve-wracking to think about it as a transaction, but sometimes you could go into these conversations with a mental checklist of, what am I looking to get out of this conversation? Am I trying to get advice? Am I trying to get an introduction to someone else in their network? Am I trying to work with this person? Going in can give you a better idea. It's almost like going grocery shopping. You'll more likely pick up what you want if you go in there with a list. So if you want an introduction to someone in their network, or if you want to work with them, make sure you're using the conversation to gently guide them towards that conclusion at the very end of the conversation. Next one is, do you have any suggestions? Reset the narrative or opinions of others may have on you if you have been established in a company or group for an extended period of time. This is a tough one. And again, one of these questions where it can be difficult for me to answer without having the full context. What I will say is, number one, it is tough. One thing that you could potentially, I'll say 2 things, being as general but as specific as I can again, where one, I would start this one-on-one, where try and find the person who is closest to you and converting them into an ally, and then converting the next person to an ally, and then the next ally. Because when I think about a group of people in a meeting room, you might have 5 people, and you may want to change the perceptions of 4 of those 5. And it's going to be really difficult to do all of that up front. Doing so one-on-one could potentially make a difference. The second thing is, if compatibility is something that may be challenging to you, starting off by potentially working with them first and really making sure that you're doing your job and doing it well and doing it promptly. Being useful to them could be a way to get the relationship started. The third is, when in doubt, ask for advice. So one option is for especially the individuals who are closer to your circle, potentially approaching them and say, hey, I've been doing some self-reflection and this has come to mind. Would you have any tips for how to navigate this? And then really making sure that you're following their advice, trying it out, checking in with them, so that they can hopefully see you as someone that they're mentoring and would want to see as an ally. Next is, how do I approach my manager about wanting to move into another area of the company or leaving their team? This one is really difficult, especially if your manager wants to keep you or isn't invested in your career. I think the first thing that I would ask myself is, how invested is your manager in your own personal growth? I think there are managers that are very transactional who will see you as your work product and won't see the person behind the work product. If that's the type of manager you have, that will be a lot more difficult, a lot more transactional. I am getting a nudge. I'm getting the hook off the stage for me to wrap up because we only have one more minute. But for those of you who are interested in email etiquette, I encourage you to get the book. And when it comes to racial unrest and social unrest, that's a really big topic. Would love to chat with you about that offline. Let me hand it back to the Ascend team so that they can announce the winners. Thank you all for your questions. This was terrific.
Thank you, Gorick, so much for that. It was really insightful. I definitely know I have picked up a couple of, definitely I have learned a few things that I need to reflect upon and, you know, and decide and, you know, make those changes so that I can grow within, and so that I can grow. So as far as the winners go, can everybody see the slide? Finally, wrapping up, again, definitely want to say thank you to Gorick again and for all of you who took the time to attend this call. We have some other events coming up. In May, we have two events. One is the Asian Heritage Month that we celebrate with Campbell Soup and KPMG. Definitely look out for emails for the date and further details on the event. We do have another event on May 4th from 12 to 1. It's a collaboration with Comcast and AAPI. And then in June, we have a discussion on anti-Asian hate crimes and speech, and this is going to be sponsored by Kreischer Miller. So again, thank you so much for joining in. Please visit our website. All right. And so please connect with us, send us emails, look us up on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. More than happy to connect. And please feel free to send an email. Again, winners, congratulations. Please send us your details. And again, if you are not able to find the email address, it's again greaterphiladelphia@ascentleadership.org. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you again, Gorick, and talk to you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.